Welcome to the Year of Prayer in the Movement, where Saint Teresa of Avila takes us by hand to a journey of inner knowledge and intimacy with the Lord. This is our second cycle in the Mothers Who Pray for Their Children spirituality, and I'm sure you remember what the 5 steps of it are: reconciliation, prayer, Eucharist, penance, and mission. This year, starting in 2025, we will be guided also by Saint Teresa of Avila through the movement's book Inner Dwelling by Angela Abdo, Father Vicente, and José Alexandre, based on the Interior Castle written by Teresa. Today's first formation, we will study 3 topics: the preface, the introduction, and all about Saint Teresa of Avila. Its preface is by Friar Patricio Scadini, an Italian priest who has lived in Brazil for 40 years and nowadays lives in Saint Teresa of the Infant Jesus Basilica in Egypt. He says, "I have been reading the book Interior Castle, and I must confess that on my first reading, I was a bit surprised. It seemed to me that Saint Teresa didn't have much to say. But later, at other times, I became convinced that Teresa indeed had a lot to say and to offer people through this book, Interior Castle. It is a special journey that the authors take through the dwellings of Saint Teresa, yet they expand upon what the doctor of the Church says, bringing into our own time the specific themes of the path to God, starting from the idea that we each have an inner house where we are called to experience God, an experience that always goes through painful moments of purification, spiritual battles, and times of crisis, which force us to stop. The authors always begin with a biblical insight, using passages chosen with wisdom and competence, showing that they navigate the Bible with ease. They then present not only what Teresa says, but also the contributions of other spiritual authors. It is true that Teresa's experience is somewhat lacking in detailed spiritual classifications, as she aims more to narrate her personal experience of communion and friendship with God. For Teresa, prayer is nothing other than an intimate dialogue with God, being alone and knowing that He loves us. The red thread that runs through every chapter of Inner Dwelling is love, which is often tainted by the capital vices and other human weaknesses that need purification. At the end of each chapter, there is an interesting new feature, a pedagogical homework assignment with several points to be worked on, not just for a moment, but over several days and perhaps even for a lifetime. It is a work of inner reflection that forces the reader to pause and reflect, not on oneself, but on God. In the homework assignments, we find many pieces of advice, not only for growth in the spiritual life, but also in human relationships with the people we live with every day. It is not easy to live in attentiveness to the other, and to see in the other not someone who competes with us, but someone who walks beside us. Reading this book helps us to discover that we are called to dialogue in 3 levels. The first is to dialogue with oneself. The second dimension is dialogue with others. And finally, the third point, dialogue with God. Prayer is an act of going beyond oneself, bringing to God our whole being and all our problems. We must not think of ourselves as divided within. A person who can engage with this threefold dialogue reaches human and spiritual maturity. When prayer is sincere, it has the power to heal our wounds and mend our traumas, whatever they may be. The book is an interior castle, and the authors begin with a description of this castle, with an entrance, pound the room, bedrooms, and so on, which at first glance may seem superficial, but upon closer reading is both intellectually profound and practically insightful. It is an excellent book of spiritual theology, set against the backdrop of Saint Teresa of Avila's interior castle, expanded with insights and information that Teresa herself could not have provided. It is a book that intentionally avoids the specialized language of mysticism and seeks instead to foster spirituality in the everyday lives of people. In the introduction, the authors share, beginning to write this book on 24th June, the Nativity of Saint John of the Baptist is prophetic. It clearly reveals the inspiration for this year of prayer, to point mothers towards Jesus Christ, so that we may introduce him to our families. John the Baptist initially went into the desert, responding to a divine call for inner development, to self-knowledge about who he was and what his mission in the world would be. The life of self-knowledge and prayer is always a call from Christ himself, who longs to have intimacy with us through prayer. The depth of intimacy is connected to our willingness to live out Jesus' desire for our kind of prayer. For prayer is the breath of the soul and the key to entering the interior castle. To begin this journey, we pause and reflect on the biography that tells us who Teresa of Avila was, a woman of the 16th century who sought a spiritual life just as many of us do. She had the courage to access her own path, to recognize her lukewarmness and frivolity, and to embrace her vocation by redirecting her life toward the age of 40, setting out on the path of perfection to have a true encounter with God and consequently to attain holiness. In addition to the consequences for her personal life, this decision allowed her to become a spiritual mother to many, a teacher of prayer, a mystic, and a doctor of the church. For the movement, Mothers Who Pray for Their Children, she also becomes an inspiration to develop our way of praying. We will begin this work with the main Teresian concepts, the choices we make and their consequences. However, instead of the metaphor of the castle, we will use the house, the dwelling place, seeking a better understanding and a closer connection to the daily life of a mother. After all, our castle is our home, where we care for and educate our children. Therefore, welcome to the inner home, where in the depths of our soul, God dwells and awaits anxiously for our return. Just as Teresa decided to dedicate more time to prayer after going through illnesses and under the guidance of her spiritual director, we all have a place of decision. We call this place Calvary because of the 3 crosses on that mount calls us to make a choice, just as it happened with the thieves beside Jesus. One accepted salvation and recognized Jesus. The other, unfortunately, did not. It is a space for each one of us to reflect on our journey and make the decision for a true conversion. Many mothers may be asking themselves how they can make this definite conversion. We have chosen the method that Saint Teresa of Avila used, based on a floor plan, because we all dwell in a house and we know that for it to be built, it required prior planning and execution. And just as each person follows a particular way in building her home, the same happens with each soul, which journeys under the impulse of the Holy Spirit and the pursuit of holiness. Each chapter includes a suggested practice to encourage that development. We remind you that what matters most is not identifying which dwelling we are in, but rather striving to eliminate the sins, vices, and imperfections that reside in our soul and prevent us from reaching holiness. Enter your inner house and with an open heart have the same experience that John the Baptist had in the desert, that Saint Teresa had in Avila, and that we the authors had as we written this book. About Saint Teresa, mother and teacher of prayer, architect of the Holy Spirit, caregiver of homes. The year 2025 marks the 510th anniversary of birth of Saint Teresa, an exceptional woman. As Pope Francis once said, prayer made Saint Teresa an exceptional woman, a creative and innovative woman. It was through prayer that she discovered the ideal of fraternity, which she sought to make a reality in the convents she founded. Therefore, revisiting the life and mission of Teresa has the initial goal of introducing her to those who wish to know the author who taught us to pray among the pots and pans. Teresa tells us that she had ups and downs in the pursuit of personal growth, but she always used her determined determination to move forward, even if it meant breaking away to start again in the way which God directed. Saint Teresa of Jesus is her religious name, but she became known by the name of her hometown, Avila, in Spain. She was born in Avila in March 1515, baptized 7 days later, and grew up in a Christian family that gave her a good education and a happy childhood. Along with her brother, she had the desire to be a missionary. In fact, her biography tells us that when they were children, they once ran away with this purpose, but both were caught and brought back home. At the age of 14, she became orphan of her mother, and concerned about her behavior, her father placed her in an Augustinian convent of Avila. This experience with some nuns and reading the letters of Saint Jerome awakened her religious vocation. Even with her father's opposition, she fled and became a Carmelite nun between 1535 and 1562 at the convent of the Incarnation, a congregation that began with the hermits of Mount Carmel in the Holy Land. The way of life in this Carmelite order was supposed to be contemplation and sacrifice for sinners through prayers and fasting. However, the true battles began with the Carmelite community, as the environment did not allow for a contemplative life due to the excessive number of nuns, relatives, and servants, in addition to the fact that many of the nuns lacked the religious vocation and inner life. Both outside and inside, the excessive noise hindered recollection. Another struggle she faced was an unknown illness, which forced her to leave the Carmelite order to receive treatment. She had to go to her sister's house and then to her father's house. During one of the visits from her uncle, she was introduced to the book The Third Spiritual Alphabet by Father Francisco de Osuna. She read it and, based on those writings, began to practice mental prayer, which became a significant breakthrough for her spiritual life. Teresa lived through the hardships and joy of a convent for 27 years, where she grew in her formation, lived moments of superficial conversion because the convent had 200 nuns, followed by a period marked by illness, which took her back to her family home and awakened her to a true path of holiness. The illness remained relentless, and she was declared dead, only not to be buried because of her father refused to accept the doctor's verdict. She woke up and began a process of both physical and spiritual healing, which would mark all her writings. After some time, she returned to the convent to recover. It was a period of formation and growth, but not in the way the warrior of Avila would have liked. Although she had already advanced in the human and spiritual dimensions, she realized she could no longer continue in that environment and made the decision to seek deeper waters, which would change the course of her history. From discomfort with the excessive noise and conversations of the nuns, she obeyed God's voice and founded the St. Joseph Carmelite Monastery in 1562, under precarious and humble conditions, beginning of the reform of Carmelite order. This would be the first of many Carmels. It was a year of struggle with a new congregation that had no resources, with apostolic approval but opposition from the city council. She lived 30 years in this battlefield and returned in 1571 as prioress of the Carmel of the Incarnation, which demonstrates that the journey in this life is long and we go through numerous battles before the final victory. According to Angela Abdo and José Alexandre, we find Teresa in an attitude similar to that of the mother of Jesus, Mary, who lived all the pains and sought to treasure them in her heart. Saint Teresa, as a founder of a religious congregations and writer, leaves a legacy for humanity in search of spiritual growth. Interestingly, despite her many external journeys, the journey that granted her the greatness of becoming a doctor of the Church was the inner journey in the search for the beloved. Upon finding him, she became a teacher of a spiritual perfection path. The year of 1563 stands out, for it marks the encounter of the nun with Saint John of the Cross. Together they would walk the path of the three ways of holiness and experience a fruitful mystical life. This partnership marked a change in Teresa's behavior, as she had not yet made a firm decision for holiness and struggled to find a spiritual director to guide her on this journey. Each in their own time reformed the Carmelite order, she the women's branch, and he later the men's, facing numerous persecutions. Her way of life attracted followers, and with the support of St. John and other friends, she founded several houses of the order, totaling 32 monasteries, 17 for women and 15 for men, all of which proposed a demanding way of life grounded in prayer, work, and silence. Teresa obtained permission to live in the Carmelo of Saint Joseph and enjoyed 5 years of a difficult but peaceful life there. However, it was only after this time that she definitely renounced the former order in 1571. She definitely established the order of the Discalced Carmelites. Teresa was graced with the opportunity to travel extensively and found numerous Carmelite convents. As a writer, in 1560, she began the Three Relations writings and completed the first version of the Book of Life, which was seized by the Inquisition. This led our saint to experience sanctification through obedience. She rewrote the book during the inquisitorial process, concluding it in 1565. In writing her autobiography in the Book of Life, as she sought perfection, envy and intrigues began to affect her. She fought an interior war and drew ever closer to Jesus through great effort, attaining victory only through grace. In the external battles, she was betrayed by her own spiritual daughters because of her conduct. Her heart was pierced in this episode, and her book was confiscated by the Inquisition. She responded with a beautiful defense before the inquisitors, who ultimately acquitted her. She declared herself a daughter of the Church and lived out the threefold foundation she herself defined and embraced in her life: humility, obedience, and love. Even torn between a deep interior life and the distractions of conversation, which led her to oscillate between profound spiritual intimacy and passing time in the visitant parlor, she managed to make a decision that would change her life and impact the life of others for millennia. In her autobiography, she describes having faced stormy seas for nearly 20 years, constantly failing and rising again with venial sins and without distancing herself from the dangers that pushed her out of the castle. In 1566, she wrote the book The Way of Perfection, which today is considered a highly regarded work of spiritual theology. Her writings are deeply influenced by the worldview shaped by the environment of Avila. In 1567, she recorded the rules in the constitutions of the Discalced Carmelites. She also produced other writings during this period, but in 1573, she wrote the Book of Foundations, which sets out the rule for the Discalced Carmels. In the year 1577, she wrote the interior castle, which she regarded as her masterpiece. It was written at the request of her spiritual director, Father Geronimo Gracian, who realized that her autobiography book, known as the Book of Life, confiscated by Inquisition, might never be recovered. She uses the metaphor of the castle with its many rooms to explain where God dwells within us and what movement we must undertake to enter the castle and face the reptiles that oppose our will to do so. By presenting the various forms of prayer in each room, she offers tools to remain steadfast in times of adversity, always seeking the center of all the dwelling places. These facts remind us that the life of the saint was not initially marked by a firm decision for holiness, nor was it only about prayers and mystical phenomena, but through human effort and the grace of God, she managed to reach a level that most people never come close to, not because it's forbidden, but because many people desire holiness without letting go of their sins, self-will, and attachments. The saint leads us to reflect on how our life is going and whether our decisions are stamped by heaven or by hell seal, showing us that the greatest legacy we can leave is the purification of our soul here on earth, striving to reach in this life betrothal and marriage with Christ. She passed away in 1582 in Alba, Spain, where she was buried. After some time, part of her body was transferred to the first Carmelite convent she has founded. She was canonized on the 12th of March, 1622 by Pope Gregory XV, and on 27th September 1970, she was granted the title of Doctor of the Church by Pope Paul VI. Her feast day is celebrated on the 15th October. Thus came to the Church's well-deserved recognition of this woman who, like us, lived through many tribulations and overcame them with a determined spirit and a literary legacy that continues to touch many lives, especially those of the mothers in our movement.